Okay, so you brought us something really fascinating this week, this idea, this intersection of cannabis and Christian faith, things that, a lot of people would see as completely separate worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. They seem contradictory on the surface, don't they?
Totally. And it leads to this, well, this provocative question. Can getting high actually bring someone closer to God? It really digs into some core beliefs.
It does. And your sources, especially that Vice EE documentary sent over, they really they pull back the curtain a bit.
Right.
We get to see these different communities actually trying to figure this out, trying to explore that connection.
And it feels like it goes way beyond the usual arguments, the medical versus recreational thing.
Exactly. It gets much more personal, much more spiritual.
So that's what we want to do today in this deep dive, really unpack it for you. Look at the motivations, the beliefs, the real challenges these groups are running into.
Yeah, give you a well-rounded picture of this, well, this emerging trend, I guess you could call it.
Okay, let's dive in then. Where should we start? Colorado with Deb Button.
Yeah, Deb's story is a great starting point because she herself was pretty skeptical about cannabis initially.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she wasn't just jumping on board. It was actually using edibles for migraines that started to shift her perspective. Quite a bit, actually.
Huh. So it started as medical, but then became something else.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about the pain relief. She talks about this one time she was on a bike ride.
Right, I remember that part.
And she just felt this incredibly vivid sense of God's love watching the sunset over the Rockies. It was like profound for her.
That feeling of connection. And you can see how that experience, especially if it's missing elsewhere, would be powerful.
Exactly. It made her start questioning things, like her experiences in a traditional church setting.
How so?
Well, she felt those moments of like deep spiritual connection were pretty rare in church. And maybe worse, she sometimes felt this undercurrent of judgment there.
Oh.
Which she said was totally absent when she used cannabis for, reflection.
So that led her to do something pretty bold.
Yeah, really bold. Almost on a whim, she posts this ad on Craigslist.
Craigslist, okay.
Yeah. Just seeing if anyone else felt the same way, interested in maybe combining cannabis and Bible study.
Yeah, but people responded.
She was surprised, yeah. Enough people responded that she formed a real group, the Stoner Bible Study group.
Wow. It just shows there was this, unmet need, maybe? A desire for community around this shared exploration.
Definitely. But that desire ran into some serious opposition.
I bet.
When word got out about her group, well, she started getting hate mail, a lot of it.
From who? Other Christians?
And more traditional Christians, accusing her of blasphemy, saying it was unholy, some really harsh stuff, calling weed evil.
It really makes you think about interpretation, doesn't it? How people read the same text so differently.
Absolutely. Deb herself said, she'd read the Bible, and she just didn't see any explicit condemnation of cannabis in there.
Which highlights that tension. Personal interpretation versus established tradition.
And it wasn't just hate mail. There were real consequences for the people involved.
Like what?
Well, one pastor who joined the group, he got kicked off his church's worship team.
Seriously?
Yeah. He and his wife felt really isolated, and they even got death threats.
Death threats.
Yeah.
Over a Bible study group.
Yeah. It got that intense. So intense that Deb felt she had to, pause the group for a while, shut it down temporarily for everyone's safety.
That's incredible. It shows how deeply rooted some views are about intoxicants and faith.
It really does. But what's also striking is Deb's resilience, and the group's desire for that non-judgmental space.
So did they start up again?
They did. She decided to reconvene.
Yeah.
And in the documentary, you see them meeting again, and there's this real sense of relief and excitement. People talk about feeling more present, more connected in those gatherings.
Compared to traditional church?
Yeah, they draw that contrast quite sharply, especially compared to, say, some megachurch experiences they might have had.
Did they say why they felt more present? Was it just the cannabis or something else?
It seemed to be a mix. Some mentioned feeling almost childlike, more in the moment. Less distracted, maybe.
Interesting.
And one member even speculated, that maybe traditional brick-and-mortar churches might decline because people are looking for something, well, more personally meaningful.
That's a big statement. It suggests a real potential shift in what people want from spirituality.
It does. Deb's story is powerful on a personal level. But is it just an isolated thing or part of something bigger?
Right, that's the question.
Yeah.
Which I guess brings us to the broader context. We need a wider lens here.
Exactly. And that's where someone like Dr. Robert Jones comes in. His work on American religious trends is really helpful here for you.
Okay, so what does Dr. Jones say about all this?
Well, he points to a really significant demographic shift happening in the U.S.
Where's-
For a long time, the U.S. was, majority white Christian, but that's not the case anymore. White Christians are now a minority.
Huh. I didn't realize that shift was official, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a relatively recent thing. And Dr. Jones suggests this change might be causing a sense of unease or distress for some conservative white Christians, people who maybe saw themselves as the moral majority before.
Okay, I can see how that shift could be unsettling.
Yeah.
But how does that connect to cannabis churches?
Well, Jones makes this broader point about religion itself, that it's not static. What we think of as core beliefs versus adaptable practices, that line can shift.
Can you give an example?
Sure. He uses the evolution of views on marriage within Christianity. Think about it just a decade or two ago. For many religious Americans, traditional marriage was seen as absolutely fundamental, non-negotiable.
Right. That's definitely changed for a lot of people, even within the faith.
Exactly. So Jones argues that Christianity has always had this dynamic, this tension between the unchanging fundamentals and practices that adapt to the times.
So the cannabis discussion could be seen as like the latest example of that adaptability, especially with legalization spreading.
That's his point. It fits into this historical pattern. And he also reminds us, America has this long tradition of religious innovation.
Meaning
Meaning when people feel like existing churches aren't meeting their spiritual needs, they often, they branch out. They form new groups, new denominations.
okay, like who?
He gives the Mormons as a classic example. They started out on the fringes, faced a lot of criticism, even persecution, but now they're a mainstream global religion.
Right. So the idea is that what seems fringe now might not stay that way.
It's possible. History shows us that. So while Deb's group is sort of incorporating cannabis into an existing framework, like Bible study, there are other groups taking it, a step further, trying to make cannabis an actual sacrament.
Okay, that sounds like a much bigger leap theologically. Where are we seeing that?
That brings us to the Healing Church, or THC in Providence, Rhode Island.
THC, okay, clever name.
Yeah. And for them, cannabis isn't just something that enhances spirituality. They see it as a sacred plant itself.
Wow.
And they have this specific belief that Jesus himself actually used cannabis oil for his healing miracles.
Whoa, okay. Where does that idea come from? That sounds controversial.
It is. Their interpretation focuses on the biblical recipes for anointing oil. There's an ingredient listed, traditionally translated as calamus, a type of reed.
Right.
But they believe the original Hebrew cannabosum or something similar was actually cannabis, and it got mistranslated over time.
So they think the holy anointing oil was cannabis oil.
That's their core belief. People in the documentary, like Jeff and Adam, they even go to a cathedral and look at religious art trying to find clues.
What kind of clues?
Well, they point to like an anointing scene where the person being anointed looks tired, not radiant, which they think shows the effects of cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
Or another piece, the story of Abraham and Isaac, where they think the angel is pointing to cannabis leaves instead of the ram in the thicket.
Okay, that's definitely an interpretation. As the documentary notes, these are open to debate, right?
Very much open to debate. Yeah. And that's where Lori Cadd comes in. She's a religious scholar who actually specializes in these cannabis religions.
Ah, perfect. What's her take?
Well, she acknowledges that, these weed churches might seem kind of unserious, maybe even laughable to outsiders.
Right.
But she argues, from a scholarly standpoint, if the people involved identify it as their religion, you have an obligation to try and understand it on those terms.
That makes sense. Treat it seriously as a religious expression.
Exactly. But she also raises this really tricky question. Where's the line between just being like spiritually stoned and that actually being a religion? Or is there even a line?
That's a tough one.
Her point is that religious experience itself is often hard to pin down, hard to put into words. It's a feeling, right? And religions aren't neat boxes. They're complex. They evolve.
So how does the law deal with that complexity if they want legal recognition as a church?
That's the crux of it. Cadd explains that courts often fall back on this sort of checklist, an orthodox laundry list, she calls it.
Like what's on the list?
Yeah. Things like, they have symbols, sacred days, shared beliefs, like a creed, rituals, You know, the kinds of things we typically associate with established religions.
Okay. And if a cannabis group doesn't tick all those boxes?
Then they might struggle to get legal recognition as a religion, which means they might not get the same protections under the law, especially regarding cannabis use itself.
Right. Because cannabis is still illegal in many places or heavily regulated.
Exactly. And Cad points out the government historically hasn't exactly been thrilled about the idea of, quote, free dispersal of cannabis.
Yeah, probably not.
So if these groups were widely recognized as religions, that could seriously challenge existing drug laws and prohibition efforts. It really becomes a battle over definitions, what counts as religion.
Fascinating. So let's get back to the Healing Church itself. What do their practices actually look like?
The documentary shows us through Nicole, one of the original members.
Okay.
She demonstrates how they make their anointing oil. It's a specific blend. Cannabis, olive oil, myrrh, cinnamon, and cardamom.
Sounds aromatic.
Yeah. And she emphasizes using the whole plant, believing all parts have healing properties.
So for them, it's not just about getting high. It's medicinal, spiritual.
Both. Nicole sees cannabis as this sacred plant, almost like the missing piece needed to bring people back to what she feels is a more authentic, healing-focused Christianity.
And the act of anointing someone with this oil. That has other layers too, right? Especially given the legal situation.
Definitely. As Nicole explains, doing that ritual, especially in states with strict marijuana laws, becomes a political statement. It's an act of religious expression that directly challenges those laws.
Which puts them at risk.
A huge risk. And that risk became reality when the church's founders, Ann Armstrong and Alan Gordon, were arrested for growing and distributing marijuana. And get this, they were arrested at a memorial specifically dedicated to religious freedom.
Wow. The irony.
Right. Nicole and others in the church see that arrest as straight-up religious persecution, a violation of their rights.
So what happened after the founders were arrested? Did the church just stop?
No. The members kept going. They continued to gather, read from the Bible, which they call their instruction book, and anoint the sick with the oil.
They see it as carrying on the work.
Exactly. Continuing what Ann and Alan started, despite the legal threats.
Okay, so we've looked at Deb's group, more focused on personal reflection and study, and the Healing Church, which is building a whole theology and ritual around cannabis as a sacrament.
Right. Two different approaches, but maybe some common ground.
Yeah, what are the common threads you see running through both these stories?
Well, one big thing is just how personal and subjective religious experience is. That seems key.
Gimme.
Meaning, for these individuals, cannabis seems to act as a kind of tool. Something that helps them access different states of mind, different ways of perceiving things, and ultimately feel a deeper spiritual connection.
Like Deb feeling God's love more vividly looking at the sunset.
Yeah, that heightened appreciation for creation. And then you have the Healing Church believing cannabis is like a direct line to Christ's healing power. Different expressions, but both point to cannabis facilitating some kind of profound experience.
It really drives home that idea that faith isn't set in stone, right?
Yeah.
It changes. It adapts to the times, to society, to individual needs.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, maybe cannabis is just becoming another way for people to find those feelings of, wonder, awe, curiosity, belonging.
The same kinds of feelings people often seek in more traditional religious settings.
Exactly. Maybe it's tapping into that same fundamental human desire for meaning and connection, just through a different pathway, using different tools, different practices.
So, wrapping this up for you, our listener, the big takeaway seems to be the sheer diversity here. The really varied ways cannabis is being woven into Christian practices now.
Yeah, from just enhancing personal prayer or study, like with Deb's group, all the way to creating brand new rituals and theologies, like the Healing Church seeing it as a sacrament.
And it's definitely not happening in a vacuum. There's this clear tension with more traditional Christian views, and of course these ongoing legal battles and questions.
Which leaves you with a pretty big question to mull over, doesn't it?
Oh.
As society's views on cannabis keep shifting and legalization spreads, how is that going to impact our understanding of religion, of spirituality itself? Are these groups we talked about, these cannabis integrating communities, are that just a temporary fringe thing, or could they actually represent the beginning of a more significant shift in America's religious landscape?
That's definitely food for thought, something to consider. Maybe it encourages you to reflect on your own ideas about spirituality, what role personal experience plays in faith.
Yeah, and maybe even dig a little into the history of religion, the relationship between mind-altering substances and spiritual practices. It's actually a really old and complex story, globally speaking.
Absolutely. Well, that gives us a lot to think about.